3 8-year-old boys went into the woods and never came back. The town of West Memphis, Arkansas was shattered. Parents locked their doors, neighbors stopped trusting each other, and law enforcement was desperate for answers. But what happened next wasn't justice. It was something far darker. This is the story of Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Kelly Jr., 3 teenagers who were accused of the unthinkable. 3 young men who spent nearly 2 decades behind bars. And a case so broken, so riddled with corruption and hysteria, that it changed the way America thinks about wrongful convictions forever. Stay with me, because this story will shake you to your core. It's May 5th, 1993, West Memphis, Arkansas, a small working-class town just across the Mississippi River from Memphis, Tennessee. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on, where life moves slow and people trust their neighbors. That evening, 3 second-grade boys, Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, all 8 years old, set out on their bicycles after school. They were supposed to be home by dark. They never made it. By nightfall, parents were panicking. By morning, search parties were moving through the streets and ditches of West Memphis. And then, on the afternoon of May 6, 1993, searchers discovered something in a drainage ditch near 10 Mile Bayou. 3 small bodies, bound, mutilated, submerged in muddy water. The images from that crime scene were so disturbing that even seasoned law enforcement officers were shaken to their core. The boys had been beaten, their injuries were severe, and the matter of the crime led investigators to jump to a chilling conclusion almost immediately. This was a ritual killing. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that will define everything that follows. West Memphis in 1993 was in the grip of something called the Satanic Panic. If you were alive in America during the 1980s and early 1990s, you remember it. Heavy metal music was considered a gateway to devil worship. Dungeons and Dragons was blamed for leading teenagers into occult practices. Churches across the country warned parents that Satan was actively recruiting their children. And law enforcement believed it too. So when 3 little boys turned up murdered in what appeared to be a ritualistic way, investigators didn't just look for a killer, they looked for a Satanist. And they found exactly who they were looking for before the investigation had barely even begun. Damien Echols was 18 years old. He wore black clothes. He listened to Metallica. He was interested in Wicca, a nature-based religion that has absolutely nothing to do with Satanism. But try explaining that to West Memphis in 1993. He was quiet, intense, and different. In a small southern town, that was enough to make you a suspect. Jason Baldwin was 16. He was Damien's best friend, quiet, loyal, and by most accounts, a gentle kid. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, nothing that would suggest he was capable of harming anyone. Jessie Kelly was also 16. He had a measured IQ of around 72, placing him in the range of mild intellectual disability. He was impressionable, socially eager, and deeply vulnerable to manipulation. These were the 3 young men that West Memphis decided were responsible for one of the most horrific crimes in Arkansas history. The investigation moved fast, too fast. Police questioned dozens of teenagers in the West Memphis area. Many of them mentioned Damien Echols, not because they had any real evidence against him, but because he was different. He was the town's outsider, its weirdo, its easy target. Detectives began building a case based almost entirely on whispers, rumors, and the town's collective fear. And then they got their confession. On June 3, 1993, less than a month after the murders, police brought Jessie Misskelley in for questioning. What followed was one of the most controversial interrogations in American criminal justice history. Jessie was questioned for approximately 12 hours. He had no lawyer present for most of that time. And remember, this was a 16-year-old boy with a significant intellectual disability, sitting alone in a room with trained police detectives who were desperate to close a case that had horrified their entire community. Only about 45 minutes of that 12-hour interrogation was recorded. Think about that for a moment. 12 hours, 45 minutes recorded. And what happened in those other 11+ hours? We don't know. We will never know. What we do know is that Jessie Misskelley eventually gave a confession, a rambling, inconsistent, factually inaccurate confession that detectives coached him through in real time.
The confession was a disaster. From an evidentiary standpoint, it was riddled with errors. Jessie initially said the murders happened in the morning. The boys were in school in the morning. He changed it to after school when detectives corrected him. He described the boys being tied with rope. They were actually tied with their own shoelaces. He got the location wrong. He got the sequence of events wrong. Nearly every specific detail he provided was either incorrect or had to be corrected by the officers questioning him. And yet, this confession became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Jessie later recanted. He said he had been pressured, manipulated, and that none of it was true. But the damage was done. The confession was out there. And in the court of public opinion, West Memphis had already made up its mind. The trials began in 1994. Jessie Misskelley was tried separately, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison plus 2 additional 20-year sentences. Then came the trial of Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin. The prosecution's case was, to put it charitably, weak. There was no physical evidence connecting either Damien or Jason to the crime scene, no DNA, no fibers, no footprints, no murder weapons, nothing that placed them anywhere near 10 Mile Bayou on the night of May 5, 1993. What the prosecution had instead was this: testimony from a jailhouse informant named Michael Carson, who claimed Jason had confessed to him in graphic detail. Carson's credibility was questionable at best. Multiple witnesses later came forward to say he had bragged about lying on the stand. They had expert testimony about the nature of the boys' wounds. A medical examiner suggested the precise, patterned injuries on the victims were consistent with a serrated knife, the kind of ritualistic cutting you might expect from someone performing occult ceremonies. They had testimony from a self-described occult expert named Dale Griffiths, who had obtained his PhD through a mail-order program and whose qualifications were, to be generous, dubious. Griffiths testified that the crime scene bore the hallmarks of occult ritual murder. The jury appeared to believe him. And they had the general atmosphere of fear and hysteria that had consumed West Memphis for nearly a year by the time the trial began. Damien Echols was found guilty of 3 counts of capital murder and sentenced to life. Jason Baldwin was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And that is where many stories would end. 3 teenagers convicted, case closed. West Memphis healed and moved on. But something remarkable happened, something that doesn't happen very often in the American criminal justice system. People started paying attention.
In 1996, documentary filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky released a film called Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills. It was a raw, unflinching look at the investigation, the trials, and the 3 young men sitting in prison for crimes that a growing number of people believed they did not commit. The film was a revelation. Viewers across America watched the footage and were stunned. They saw the flimsiness of the evidence. They saw Jessie Miskelly's confession being walked through by detectives. They saw Damien Echols, thoughtful, articulate, clearly intelligent, sitting on death row in Arkansas. And they saw something that many of them immediately recognized as a profound injustice. The West Memphis Three became a cause. Celebrities got involved. Henry Rollins, Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, Johnny Depp, Natalie Maines of the Dixie Chicks. These weren't just casual supporters. They became deeply committed advocates who raised money, raised awareness, and used their platforms to keep the case in the public eye. New legal teams were assembled, innocence organizations got involved, and investigators began looking at the evidence, or rather, the lack of it, with fresh eyes. What they found over the following years was damning. The wound evidence that the prosecution had used to suggest occult ritual murder, forensic experts looking at the photographs concluded that many of the injuries were consistent not with knife wounds, but with animal predation, specifically snapping turtles and other wildlife commonly found in drainage ditches in Arkansas. What had looked like precise ritualistic cutting to the original medical examiner looked very different to experts who weren't operating under the assumption that a satanic cult was responsible. The confession? Independent psychologists and interrogation experts reviewed the recording and identified it as a textbook example of a false confession extracted through coercive interrogation techniques. The pattern of errors, getting facts wrong and then correcting them when prompted by detectives, is a hallmark of contaminated confession evidence. And then there was the DNA.
In 2007, DNA testing that had not been available at the time of the original trials produced results that were staggering. No DNA from Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, or Jessie Miskelly was found at the crime scene. Not a single trace. But DNA from an unknown male was found on one of the victims, and mitochondrial DNA consistent with Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of victim Steve Branch, was found on a ligature used to bind one of the boys. Terry Hobbs. This name had come up before. In the years since the convictions, several people had come forward with information suggesting that Terry Hobbs might have been involved in the murders. A neighbor named David Jacoby told investigators that he had spent the evening of May 5, 1993 with Hobbs, and that at one point during the evening, Hobbs had disappeared for a period of time that he could not account for. Another witness claimed that Terry Hobbs had once made a statement suggesting he knew more about what had happened to the boys than he should have known. Hobbs denied all of it. He has never been charged in connection with the murders. But the DNA evidence, the DNA that pointed away from the West Memphis Three and towards someone else, changed everything. By 2010, the legal battle had reached a critical point. Arkansas courts were finally being forced to confront the mountain of new evidence that had accumulated over 17 years. Damien Echols, still on death row, was running out of time. His execution date was approaching, and his legal team, now one of the most sophisticated innocence legal operations in the country, was fighting on every possible front. And then, the state of Arkansas offered a deal. It was called an Alford plea, named after the 1970 Supreme Court case, North Carolina versus Alford. It's a legal mechanism that allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution has enough evidence to potentially convict them. In other words, you plead guilty
without actually admitting guilt. It's a deeply strange legal instrument, and it put Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley in an impossible position. Think about what they were being asked to do. They had spent 18 years in prison for crimes they said they did not commit. They had maintained their innocence through every appeal, every hearing, every moment of their incarceration. And now, the state of Arkansas was saying, plead guilty, walk free, or stay in prison and keep fighting, while Damien's execution date loomed. Jason Baldwin reportedly didn't want to take the deal. He wanted to keep fighting. He believed they could win. He didn't want to put his name on a guilty plea for something he said he never did. But Damien was on death row, and Damien's lawyers made clear that without the Alford plea, Damien might be executed before the courts ever got around to fully addressing the new evidence. Jason Baldwin, according to accounts from those present, wept, and then he agreed to the plea, not for himself, but for Damien. That is either one of the most profound acts of friendship in the history of wrongful conviction cases, or a devastating commentary on a justice system that forced innocent men to choose between freedom and truth. Maybe it's both. On August 19, 2011, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley Jr. walked out of prison. After 18 years. Damien was 36 years old. He had spent nearly half his life on death row. He had lost the prime years of his youth, his 20s, his early 30s, sitting in a cell, waiting to be executed for a crime that an enormous body of evidence suggests he did not commit. Jason was 33. He had gone into prison as a 16-year-old child and come out as a middle-aged man. Jessie was 33 as well. The scenes outside the courthouse were extraordinary. Supporters who had followed the case for years were there, weeping, cheering, holding signs. Celebrities who had championed the cause were there. And 3 men who had spent the better part of their lives in an Arkansas prison blinked in the sunlight and tried to figure out how to begin. What happens to a person after something like that? Damien Echols has spoken extensively about the psychological devastation of spending 18 years on death row. He has described the way that prolonged extreme stress changes a person at a fundamental level. The hypervigilance, the difficulty trusting people, the strange experience of re-entering a world that had completely transformed in the years he was away. He had never used the internet before. He had never owned a smartphone. He had watched the world change through a narrow window and a few books, and then suddenly he was in it again. He turned to a deep study of ceremonial magic and meditation as coping mechanisms during his years on death row, practices that, ironically, had contributed to the suspicion against him in the first place. He has written books. He has given lectures. He married Lori Davis, a woman who had become a passionate advocate for his release after watching Paradise Lost, and who had eventually begun corresponding with him while he was on death row. Their story, of a woman who fell in love with a man she believed was innocent and dedicated years of her life to freeing him, is itself remarkable. Jason Baldwin became a lawyer. Think about that. A man who was denied justice by the legal system for 18 years became an attorney so that he could fight for others who find themselves in similar situations. He graduated from law school and has worked with innocence organizations. Jessie Misskelley's road has been harder. He returned to Arkansas, the state that had imprisoned him, and has lived a relatively private life. The stigma of being one of the West Memphis Three, even in freedom, is not easy to escape. And the actual murders? The murders of Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers? they remain officially unsolved. No one has ever been charged in connection with the deaths of those 3 8-year-old boys. The families of the victims are divided. Some believe the West Memphis Three were guilty all along. Others, including the father of one victim, became convinced of their innocence and advocated publicly for their release. Steve Branch's biological father, Todd Moore, was among the most vocal in believing that Echols, Baldwin, and Miss Kelly were responsible. He has been publicly critical of the media coverage, the documentaries, and what he sees as the romanticization of the West Memphis Three at the expense of his son's memory. That perspective deserves acknowledgement. Whatever the truth is about who killed those boys, 3 children died, 3 families were destroyed, and in the rush to focus on the compelling narrative of wrongful conviction, the victims can sometimes fade into the background. Their names were Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. They were 8 years old. They liked to ride bikes, and they deserve to be remembered. The West Memphis Three case didn't just change 3 lives, it changed American culture. The Paradise Lost documentary trilogy, 3 films spanning from 1996 to 2011, is considered one of the most influential true crime documentary series ever made. It helped birth the modern true crime movement that now dominates podcasts, streaming platforms, and television. Serial, Making a Murderer, The Jinx. The genre that all of those shows belong to has roots, at least in part, in what Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky started in that small Arkansas town. The case also accelerated important reforms in how courts handle false confession evidence, how expert witnesses in occult-related cases are qualified, and how DNA evidence is used in post-conviction proceedings. It raised fundamental questions about how America treats its outsiders, about what happens when fear overrides reason, about the terrifying ease with which an innocent person can be swept into the criminal justice system and never find their way out. There's a detail about this case that I want you to sit with for a moment. When Damien Echols was first brought in for questioning by West Memphis police, he was 18 years old. He was a teenager who wore black clothes and read books about alternative religions. He was odd, he was different, he made people uncomfortable. In the months between the murders and his arrest, Damien had done something that investigators would later point to as evidence of his cold, sociopathic nature. He had been seen smiling, laughing, acting normal. But here's the thing. Damien Echols didn't know Steve Branch, Michael Moore, or Christopher Byers. He had no connection to them. He was a teenager going about his life in the same town where a horrible thing had happened. And in the eyes of West Memphis, Arkansas, the fact that he was able to continue existing while grieving families mourned was proof of his guilt. The psychology of that is worth understanding, because it's not unique to this case. It happens over and over again in wrongful conviction cases. The suspect who doesn't cry enough, the suspect who seems too calm, the suspect who laughs at the wrong moment. We assign emotional scripts to how innocent people should behave, and when someone doesn't follow that script, we reach for the darkest possible explanation. Damien Echols smiled and nearly died for it. I want to take you back to something. That 45-minute recording of Jessie Miss Kelly's 12-hour interrogation. We live in an era now where we know a tremendous amount about false confessions. The Innocence Project has documented dozens of cases where people confessed to crimes they did not commit. Research has established that certain populations, juveniles, people with intellectual disabilities, people subjected to prolonged questioning, are particularly vulnerable to producing false confessions. But in 1993, that knowledge was not widely understood. Jurors heard a confession and thought, why would anyone confess to something they didn't do? It defies logic. It defies human nature. Except it doesn't. Psychological research has demonstrated conclusively that false confessions are real, they are not rare, and they are extraordinarily persuasive to juries. A false confession is one of the most dangerous pieces of evidence that can be introduced in a trial, precisely because it seems so impossible to fabricate. Jessie Misskelley was 16 years old, intellectually limited, and had been sitting in an interrogation room for most of a day. Whatever happened in those 11+ hours unrecorded, it produced a confession that sent 3 people to prison for 18 years. There's one more element of this story I need you to understand, because it speaks to something about America, about how we treat the strange, the different, the people who don't fit. The Satanic Panic that provided the cultural backdrop for this case didn't come from nowhere. It was the product of a specific historical moment, a moment of profound social anxiety in America, when rapid cultural change, new music, new media, and generational conflict between parents and teenagers created a kind of collective hysteria. Heavy metal music was genuinely feared by large numbers of American parents in the 1980s and early 1990s. Books like Michelle Remembers, a now thoroughly discredited account of supposed satanic ritual abuse, were bestsellers. Documentaries warning about the dangers of Satanism aired on mainstream television. Law enforcement agencies held seminars teaching police officers to recognize the signs of occult involvement. It was mass delusion. Historical hindsight allows us to see it clearly. But when you're inside it, when every institution around you is reinforcing the same narrative, it is almost impossible to resist. Damien Echols was caught in the machinery of that mass delusion, and it nearly killed him. The West Memphis Three case forces us to ask hard questions, not just about the criminal justice system, though it should absolutely make us question how cases are investigated, how confessions are obtained, and how experts are qualified. Not just about the Satanic Panic, though understanding that moment of American history is essential. It forces us to ask ourselves about the human tendency to find a villain when something terrible happens, about the comfort of a simple explanation in the face of something that is genuinely complex and disturbing, about what we do with people who are different, who don't conform, who make us uneasy. 3 children were murdered in West Memphis, Arkansas in 1993. The community needed someone to blame. And rather than doing the painstaking, difficult work of actually finding who was responsible, they found 3 teenagers who wore black and listened to the wrong music. And the American justice system went along with it.
Here is where we stand today. The West Memphis Three are free. They remain convicted of the murders under the terms of their Alford plea, which means the state of Arkansas never formally exonerated them. They live with that legal status, technically guilty, practically unable to clear their names in any official sense. Ongoing advocacy continues to push for formal exoneration. As of now, it has not happened. The actual killer, if it was not the West Memphis Three, and the evidence strongly suggests it was not, has never been identified, never been charged, and may well have spent the past 3 decades walking free. Damien Echols continues to speak and write about the case. He has become one of the most prominent voices on wrongful conviction in America. His memoir, Life After Death, is a powerful account of his experiences. Jason Baldwin practices law and works with innocence causes. Jessie Misskelley lives in Arkansas. And somewhere, possibly, the person who beat 3 8-year-old boys to death and left them in a drainage ditch in West Memphis is still out there.
The West Memphis Three. Three names that became synonymous with one of the most significant wrongful conviction cases in American history. A story about fear and hysteria and the terrifying fragility of justice. A story about what happens when a community decides it already knows the answer before the investigation has even really begun. Damien Echols was 17 years old when 3 boys were murdered in his town. He was 36 when he finally walked out of prison. 18 years for a crime the evidence strongly suggests he did not commit. If that doesn't make you question things, I don't know what will. The truth about what happened on the night of May 5, 1993, in West Memphis, Arkansas, may never be fully known, but we know this much. 3 children deserved justice. They never got it. 3 teenagers deserved fairness. They never got that either. And somewhere between those 2 failures, a small American town lost something it may never get back.